On the frozen morning of December 18, 2044, the world of war seemed to lose its balance. Every expert claimed Nazi Germany was finished. Every map drawn in Allied headquarters insisted the fighting was nearly done. Yet, on a silent bridge in Belgium, a 19-year-old American stood face to face with a steel monster that should not have been there. A German King Tiger tank weighing more than 70 tons loomed out of the mist like a nightmare born from iron and fire. This beast could shatter houses from 2 miles away. Its thick armor turned Allied shells into harmless sparks. It was the undisputed giant of 20th century armored warfare. Opposite it stood Francis Curry, a thin, quiet farm boy turned soldier who weighed barely 130 pounds. He had no tanks behind him. He had no friendly aircraft in the sky. He had only a freezing ditch of battered bazooka and a manual that suggested his life expectancy was already over. But Francis Curry came from a world where manuals did not matter. On the farm, if a wolf came for the animals, you did not read instructions. You grabbed whatever tool was in reach and fought. In the next 10 minutes, this quiet orphan would do things that no training guide had imagined. He would change the course of the Battle of the Bulge. He would perform feats that would later sound like stories invented for films. Yet every moment was true. To understand how this lone soldier ended up challenging the full force of a German armored push, you must go back to the trap he unknowingly stepped into. The Ardennes Forest, December 2044. American troops called this area the Ghost Front. It was calm too calm. This was where tired units were sent to rest, and where new soldiers were placed so they could get used to the front without much danger. The snow lay untouched, the trees stood still. Letters home spoke about Christmas and quiet nights, but the peace was a mask. Deep inside the woods, Adolf Hitler was gathering the last strength of his collapsing empire. He had one final gamble, a desperate and reckless strike designed to break the Allied lines in one blow. His generals warned him that it was madness, but he ignored them. He stripped men from the Eastern Front. He pulled boys from classrooms and old workers from factories. He gathered elite SS Panzer forces and sent more than 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks through the dark forest. They moved at night. They spoke over no radios. The Allied intelligence experts had declared the Ardennes impossible for tanks in winter. Heavy fog rolled over the region, the kind American reconnaissance pilots called Hitler weather. It blinded the skies and grounded the aircraft that normally watched every German move. Under that cover, the armored spearhead crept forward unseen. On December 17th, Francis Curry and Company K of the 120th Infantry reached the town of Malmedy. Their task was simple: guard a bridge. It was supposed to be routine, a quiet assignment for a small unit. None of them knew that they were standing directly in the path of the largest German attack of the entire war. The temperature sank to 0. The ground became so solid that digging a foxhole demanded explosives. The men shivered in thin jackets, their boots stiff with ice. Francis moved among them, silent as always. Most 19-year-olds in uniform bragged loudly about what they would do in battle. Francis did not. He stared at the tree line, at the drifting fog, feeling something dark in the air. A farmer learns to sense trouble even before it appears. When the wind shifts, when the birds go quiet, you know the storm has already begun. So who was this boy facing the greatest armored push of the German army? Francis Curry was born in 1925 in New York, but his childhood ended early. By 12, he was an orphan drifting through foster homes and distant relatives until he finally ended up on a farm in Indiana. Life there was harsh. He was not treated like family. He was labor. From sunrise to sunset, he hauled hay, fixed fences, and drove heavy equipment. It shaped him. It taught him silence. It taught him that crying never solved a problem and complaining never fixed a broken gate. If you needed something done, you found a way, no matter how difficult. That was not military discipline. That was survival. While other boys played games, Francis learned responsibility and self-reliance. No one was coming to save him. When war erupted, he tried to enlist at 17, but the recruiter laughed, telling him the rifle weighed almost as much as he did. He returned at 18 after forcing himself to eat enough to reach the minimum weight. The army saw a frail kid fit only for desk work. They did not see the years of grit in his hands or the sharp, quiet focus in his eyes. He joined the infantry, and by July 1944, he was fighting in Europe. He was not the loud one in the unit. He did not try to impress anyone. But when shells fell and chaos erupted, he became steady, calm, and precise. He treated battle the same way he treated a broken tractor as a problem to solve. He mastered the bar, a weapon few men handled well, and he learned the bazooka, which most considered unreliable and dangerous. Months passed. He grew into leadership, but nothing in his life could prepare him for what waited in the fog of December 16th at 5:30 in the morning. The Ghost Front erupted under the fire of 1,600 German artillery guns. The forest shook like the earth itself wanted to break apart. The American line collapsed, units vanished, roads filled with retreating troops, but Company K received a single order: hold the bridge. They dug in, listening to rumors of SS troops executing prisoners and of enormous tanks pushing forward. By December 18th, Francis and his men were nearly alone. Their position was fragile, their weapons limited, and from the mist, the first King Tiger appeared, its cannon turning slowly toward the building that held his friends. In that instant, Francis saw the truth. No one was coming. No air support, no tanks, no rescue. He looked at the bazooka, then at the approaching monster. He took a breath, stood, and fired the rocket, screaming across the air. It struck the turret ring with a harsh, metallic clang. It did not pierce the armor, but it tore away the tank optics. The King Tiger was blind, and the battle for 10 impossible minutes had begun. Francis Curry had never looked like the kind of man who would bend the course of a battle. He stayed quiet in the ranks, rarely drawing attention during marches or briefings. But when the front erupted in chaos, his calm turned into something the others depended on. In the months leading up to the Battle of the Bulge, Francis began to show a strange talent for survival. Mortar shells would come screaming down, and while others ducked or froze, he instantly scanned the terrain for advantage, like a farmer studying the sky before a storm. Confusion never slowed him. Orders that arrived garbled or incomplete did not shake his focus. Combat for him was a puzzle. It was broken machinery waiting for the right hands to set it right. He carried the bar with ease, even though it was a weapon built for men with far more muscle. He learned to tame the bazooka to a tool most soldiers hated because its battery could fail or the backblast could kill you if you aimed wrong. But Francis studied it, tested it, understood it, the way he once understood the tractors on the farm. His quiet competence earned him more responsibility, and by December 1944, he wore the stripes of a sergeant leading a squad of men who respected him without needing him to talk much. Yet nothing he had seen, no skirmish, no shelling, no desperate retreat, could have prepared him for the nightmare force that would soon pour out of the fog. On December 16th at 5:30 in the freezing morning darkness, the German army unleashed a storm unlike anything the Americans had faced since the start of the war. 1,600 artillery guns roared together, shaking the ground for miles. Trees shattered, snow blasted into the air as if the forest itself had been hit by a hurricane made of steel. Communication lines snapped or went silent. Entire units disappeared in minutes. The German advance was swift, ruthless, and terrifying. Their armored columns punched through weak points, and their infantry fanned out, sweeping aside thin American defenses with brutal efficiency. Roads filled with retreating soldiers, medics, cooks, clerks, anyone trying to escape the crushing weight of the offensive. But in the town of Malmedy, Company K held their ground. The bridge over the Warch River was their charge. If they abandoned it, the German force could sweep around the flank and collapse the entire defense. Francis and his squad prepared for the worst digging in where the frozen earth refused to yield. Refugees and scattered soldiers rushed past them, warning of tanks larger than any they had imagined and of SS troops taking no prisoners. What had happened only a few miles away at a crossroads that morning confirmed the terror. An SS armored unit had captured more than 80 American soldiers, lined them up in a field, and executed them. Word of the Malmedy massacre raced along the American lines. It arrived like a cold hand gripping every soldier by the spine. These enemies would not spare the wounded. They would not show mercy. By dawn on December 18th, Francis and his platoon were almost cut off. They held a fragile position built on thin hope and frozen mud. They had rifles, a machine gun, and a pile of anti-tank mines that were useless because the ground was too hard to dig into. Francis surveyed the town with the eye of someone who understood landscapes deeply. The official doctrine insisted that when enemy armor overwhelmed infantry, the infantry must retreat to secondary positions to avoid annihilation. But Francis was not thinking about doctrine. He was thinking about angles, cover, and opportunity. He studied the factory building near the bridge, noticing how tank shells might strike it. He examined the nearby houses, the hedges, the ditch lines. He was not planning retreat. He was planning resistance one step at a time. The first warning came as a vibration, not a sound. The trees trembled, dusting snow from their branches. Then came the metal shriek of ungreased treads, and the deep growl of engines too large for comfort. Francis crouched in his foxhole by the bridge, raising his head slowly above the snow. From the swirling morning mist, a colossal shape materialized. White and grey winter camouflage streaked its surface in jagged lines. Its 88mm cannon extended outward like a long iron spear. The King Tiger had arrived. This was not simply a tank. This was the lead spear of the 1st SS Panzer Division elite soldiers, handpicked to defend the German leader himself. Behind the tank, infantry shadows moved, dozens of them stepping through the snow with practiced precision. Francis looked left and right. His squad was outnumbered many times over and hopelessly outgunned. The tank halted as if sniffing the battlefield. Its turret rotated slowly, searching for a target. When the barrel dropped toward the factory, he felt fear tighten inside him like a rope. His friends were inside that building. If the tank fired, the blast would tear the structure apart, crushing anyone hiding behind its walls. That single moment changed everything. Francis realized that all the rules of war, all the procedures he had been taught, no longer applied. There was no artillery support, no planes, no tanks, no reinforcements. The bridge would fall unless someone acted. He turned and saw the bazooka lying in the snow beside him. He understood the risk of using it. The weapon was unpredictable in this cold, and standing to fire it meant exposing himself to every rifle and machine gun pointed his way. But Francis Curry had lived his life solving impossible problems. He had done it as a boy, working alone in fields fixing equipment that no one else bothered to teach him. He had done it on the front lines when the world collapsed around him. He did not hesitate. He rose from the foxhole bazooka on his shoulder. He aimed at the massive tank whose armor could shrug off most shells. He fired. The rocket screamed through the icy air, leaving a trail of smoke behind it. Francis dropped instantly back into the ditch, knowing the tank gunner would react. The rocket struck the turret ring with a sound like a hammer hitting a bell. It did not destroy the tank. It did not even crack the armor. What it did was disable the optics. Inside the steel beast, the crew suddenly lost their vision. The turret jerked left and right blindly. A deafening roar followed as the 88mm cannon fired without aim, blasting the factory wall above Francis into broken brick and swirling debris. He was buried for a moment, gasping as shock waves stole the air from his lungs. When the dust cleared, he checked his bazooka. No rockets left. By every rule of war, this should have been the end. A lone soldier weapon spent, pinned by a tank and surrounded by advancing infantry. Yet for Francis, the situation was not hopeless. It was merely a new problem, and he knew exactly how to solve problems. The blast from the King Tiger had shaken Francis so violently that the world rang with a high, thin whistle he could not escape. Dust coated his face. His breath came in sharp, painful bursts. Most men pinned under the fury of an 88mm cannon stayed down. Most curled into themselves, praying that the next explosion would be quick. But Francis Curry did not measure danger the way ordinary men did. He blinked through the swirling snow, checked the empty bazooka tube, and accepted the fact that he was out of rockets. By any logical standard, his fight should have ended here. One soldier against a blind but very much alive tank and an entire team of SS infantry pushing forward through the ruined street. Yet the farm boy mind that had solved broken engines and collapsing fences since childhood refused to stop. When the tractor dies, you do not sit beside it. You walk to the barn, you get more fuel, you make it work. Francis lifted his head and scanned the battlefield through smoke and shattered bricks. That was when he saw it. A half-track abandoned by retreating American troops earlier that morning. It sat near the entrance of the factory where 5 of his own men were trapped. Snow had gathered on its hood. The engine was cold. But what mattered was the crate in the back. A wooden box marked with yellow ordnance symbols, rockets, fresh rockets. Between Francis and that half-track lay 50 yards of open ground turned into a killing field. German machine guns were firing in overlapping angles, filling the air with angry streaks of light. Snow kicked up where bullets struck only inches from where he crouched. Running across that space was suicide. Staying put was surrender. Neither option fit the boy from Indiana. He clutched the empty bazooka. He inhaled the freezing air until it cut his throat. Then he ran, his boots hammered into the snow. His thin frame moved with the strange, clumsy speed of a farm kid used to chasing down stray livestock across uneven fields. Bullets sang past him close enough to burn the air. He felt one tear through his sleeve without touching skin. He dove behind the half-track, rolling hard into the treads, bruising his ribs. The impact stole his breath, but he did not stop. He scrambled up the side, reached the crate, and tore it open with stiff, numb fingers. Wood splintered, rockets glimmered within. He loaded one into the bazooka, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. But when he looked back to the street, the battlefield had shifted again. The King Tiger he had blinded had pulled back behind a farmhouse to regain its bearings. In its place came 3 German Panzer IVs rolling forward with ruthless precision. These were not as thick or monstrous as the Tiger, but they were faster and deadly sharp, supported by infantry sweeping house to house. They believed they were assaulting an entire platoon based on the level of resistance. Little did they know it was a single soldier powering the chaos. Francis crouched behind the half-track, lifted the bazooka, and took aim at the lead panzer. The cold made the weapon temperamental. Batteries often froze, refusing to ignite the rocket propellant. He struck the side of the tube with the heel of his hand, praying the internal circuit would close. He squeezed the trigger. The rocket spiraled out with a roar, cutting through the air like a spear. It struck the front tank squarely in the tracks. The explosion blew the steel links apart, sending fragments flying into the snow. The tank lurched violently, losing control, and skidded into a ditch, immobilized. A perfect target. The other 2 panzers halted, confused, unable to locate the source of the attack. They assumed an anti-tank team or hidden destroyer was firing at them from across the town. None of them imagined a single boy crouched behind an abandoned vehicle orchestrating their delay, but Francis had no time to celebrate. German infantry were advancing toward the factory where his 5 comrades were still trapped. If they reached the doorway, they would throw grenades inside, ending every life within seconds. He needed more than a bazooka. He needed something that could deal with the rushing soldiers. He needed a machine gun. His eyes scanned the battlefield and found what he sought. A fallen American lay beside a jeep not far from the frozen ground. Next to the body was a bar, the Browning automatic rifle, powerful, deadly, and capable of laying down a sheet of fire. Francis dropped the bazooka. He ran again through the storm of bullets. He slid to the ground beside the fallen soldier. He seized the bar, checked the magazine, then rolled onto his stomach, bracing the heavy weapon on a chunk of broken stone. The gun roared. The bar fired the same heavy cartridge as the American sniper rifles, but at hundreds of rounds per minute. The recoil rocked his thin shoulders, yet his aim stayed sharp. He swept the German line with controlled bursts, not wasting rounds. He was not panicking. He was protecting his own the way a farmer protects livestock from wolves. 3 German soldiers nearing the factory door dropped instantly. Others dove behind a low wall, screaming for cover fire and medical support. Francis shifted position, constantly rolling, sliding, crawling through wreckage. He fired until the bar clicked empty. Then he reached for the bazooka, fired another rocket at shifting armor, then returned once more to the machine gun. He moved between weapons like a juggler, keeping knives in the air, never staying still long enough for enemy rifles to lock onto him. For 10 long minutes, he became a one-man army. To the Germans, it felt like they were fighting a coordinated defense of at least a dozen trained soldiers. Rockets came from one direction, machine gun bursts from another. Shadows moved where no formation could possibly exist. They thought they faced an entrenched American unit trained to halt a full armored spearhead. In reality, it was one exhausted orphan sprinting across the frozen ruins, bleeding hands, numbed by the cold lungs, burning from icy air, switching weapons faster than they could track. But the Germans adapted quickly. They fixed his general location near the half-track. An officer barked an order, a tank turret turned, a shell shrieked. The explosion struck 10 feet from where Francis lay. The blast lifted him off the ground, throwing him against the wall of the factory. His ears bled, his vision blurred. Shrapnel tore through his coat, slicing the skin beneath. Snow settled over him as he lay momentarily breathless, staring up at the gray sky. His body urged him to stop. Every part of him screamed to surrender to the cold, but that was not how Francis Curry lived. He spat blood into the snow. He tested his limbs. They moved. Pain shot through his ribs, his arms, his legs, but they worked. He pushed himself upright. The Germans saw him rise. They must have wondered what kind of man they were fighting. A normal soldier would have died, yet this one kept standing. But Francis still had one more card to play. He reached into his satchel and pulled out improvised anti-tank grenades, heavy, unstable, and deadly. He pulled the pin on one. He counted a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats. Then he rose fully into view and threw it with the same accuracy that had come from years of throwing stones at crows back home. The grenade soared over the wall where German infantry hid. The explosion tore through their position, sending soldiers screaming and scrambling for cover. The line wavered, the advance stalled. They were fighting not a man, but a force of nature. And Francis sensed he had bought the smallest sliver of time, enough perhaps to turn the impossible into the merely unbelievable. The Germans could not understand what they were facing. To them, the battlefield roared with fire from several directions, rockets from the left machine gun, bursts from the right, grenades arcing out of broken walls. They believed they were fighting a coordinated squad, fortified inside the ruins of Malmedy. They imagined a hidden anti-tank team, a machine gunner positioned in a sniper nest, and perhaps another soldier moving through the rubble throwing grenades. What they did not know was that all of this chaos came from one thin 19-year-old who had been fighting non-stop in sub-zero cold for minutes that felt like hours. Francis Curry, however, was beginning to feel the weight of everything he had done. Every sprint drained his lungs. Every trigger pull rattled his bones. His hands were bleeding from splintered crates, sharp metal, and frozen stone. His breaths came out as painful clouds that burned the inside of his chest. He had moved between the bar and the bazooka so many times that the cold had fused ice around the straps of each weapon. He knew he could not keep this pace forever, and the Germans were starting to understand the pattern of his fire. They adjusted their angles, they changed their positions, and then they struck. A German officer pointed toward the half-track where Francis had fired his most recent burst. A tank turret shifted its direction with slow, precise malice. Francis sensed the danger a half-second before the world erupted. Boom! The shell landed 10 feet from him, slamming into the earth with a force that tore the air apart. Francis felt himself lifted clean off the ground. Time stretched into something strange, a long, slow tumble suspended in frost. Then he crashed hard into the stone wall of the factory behind him. The world flashed white, then black. His ears screamed with a piercing ring. Warmth spread down his neck. His vision swam in and out like flickering lantern light. Shrapnel had ripped through his coat, carving bloody grooves into his skin. Snow and dust settled over him as if trying to bury him. For a moment he did not know where he was. For a moment he did not know if he was alive. The human body is designed to quit at this point. Shock slows the limbs. Pain numbs into a distant hum. Muscles relax and surrender to gravity. Everything invites you to lie still and sleep. But Francis Curry had never lived a life where quitting solved anything. On the farm, when a machine exploded into pieces, you did not sit there staring. You picked up whatever remained and you kept going. Francis rolled over slowly, spitting blood into the snow. His ribs felt cracked, his arms shook, but his fingers still moved when he commanded them. His legs responded when he forced them. He could not stop now. The Germans were preparing to move. A squad of infantrymen crouched behind a low wall, watching for the moment he failed to rise. They had flamethrowers. Francis saw the bulky fuel tanks strapped to their backs. One blast from those weapons would turn the factory and everything inside it into a burning tomb. His 5 trapped comrades would never escape. He reached into his satchel again. This time his hands closed around one of the modified anti-tank grenades, heavy, awkward, and extremely dangerous. You were not supposed to throw them by hand. They were designed to be shot from a rifle. But Francis had adjusted the fuses earlier, knowing someday he might need them. He pulled the pin. He held the fuse for a heartbeat. 2 heartbeats. Then he rose fully into sight, presenting himself as a perfect target. The German soldiers saw him and began to raise their rifles, but Francis threw with the accuracy of a boy who had spent 10 years hitting distant fence posts with stones. The grenade flew in a clean arc over the low stone wall. The blast that followed was enormous. Fire bloomed into the sky. German screams echoed through the street. The entire advance staggered to a halt. Flames licked the snow, leaving black streaks across the white ground. But Francis knew the reprieve would not last. The Germans had lost men, but not their momentum. He needed something bigger, something louder. Something that would force the enemy to keep their heads down long enough for his trapped brothers to escape. His eyes fell on the half-track again. This time not the broken crate or the armor of the abandoned vehicle, but the top of it. Mounted on a ring stood a .50 caliber machine gun, the maddest the weapon American troops trusted more than almost anything else. It was a beast that could tear through brick and light armor with ease. If he reached it, he could create a wall of fire large enough to stall the entire German push. If he reached it, he could save the men in the factory. If he reached it, he might also die. Francis did not hesitate. He climbed. Bullets struck the metal plates around him, sparking into bright white flashes. He pulled himself onto the ring mount, gripping the thick handles of the .50 caliber. The sheer weight of the weapon sent tremors through his thin arms. He pressed his cheek against the cold metal, braced his feet, and pulled the trigger. The .50 caliber roared like thunder, splitting the frozen air. The recoil surged through his chest. Tracers streaked across the battlefield in glowing arcs. He aimed first at a German self-propelled gun, creeping forward to finish the job. The rounds slammed into its vision port. Sparks flew. The vehicle jerked backwards, crashing into a house in confusion. Then Francis turned the weapon on the infantry. He swept the street, forcing every German soldier to duck behind cover. He did not stop. He did not slow. He fired until black smoke curled from the gun belt and the barrel glowed with heat. The factory door burst open behind him. His 5 trapped comrades stumbled into the open, dragging their wounded across the snow toward the woods. Francis kept firing, covering them with every round he had. He knew that as long as he held the enemy in place, his brothers would live. Finally, the .50 caliber clicked. It jammed. He pulled the charging handle. It stuck. He pulled again. Frozen oil refused to budge. The gun was dead. Silence fell over the battlefield like an executioner raising an axe. The Germans looked up, realizing the roar had stopped. They rose slowly, weapons, ready, their rage boiling to the surface. Francis was left standing alone on top of a silent half-track in the center of the street. He was out of rockets, out of grenades, out of machine gun fire. The German rifles lifted toward him. He had maybe 3 seconds left. Francis dove off the half-track as bullets shredded the snow where he had been standing a heartbeat before. He hit the ground, rolled hard, then crawled toward the factory ruins, dragging his wounded body through dust and frost. He slipped through a jagged hole in the wall and vanished into the darkness. His chest burned, his limbs trembled, and his last reserves of strength faded. He had 16 bullets left in his M1 rifle. 16 rounds against an army, and yet he knew the fight was not done. Not while the bridge still stood behind him. Not while the Germans still believed they could take it. Not while he still drew breath. Francis lay inside the dark shell of the ruined factory, his breath trembling in the cold air, his ribs aching with each inhale. His hands felt numb as if carved from ice. His ears still rang from the earlier blast, the world around him muffled and distant like a fading dream. Snowflakes drifted through broken windows, settling on his coat, melting slowly from the heat of his battered body. He forced his fingers to move, checking the M1 rifle that lay across his chest. 2 clips remained. 16 rounds, that was all. Outside he heard the first German boots crunch against the snow. Harsh commands echoed through the street, bouncing off ruined walls. The Germans had been humiliated. They had lost tanks, half-tracks, and entire squads to one invisible opponent. Now they were coming to finish him. Flamethrower teams advanced slowly, ready to flush out any American hiding place. The thought of fire filled Francis with a fear deeper than bullets. He had seen what those weapons did to men, what screams sounded like when flesh met burning fuel. He forced himself to sit up, bracing against a shattered beam. The pain tore through him, but he welcomed it because pain meant he was still alive and still able to move. The factory around him was no longer a building. It was a skeleton stripped bare by artillery and tank fire. Walls gaped open to the grey winter sky. Long shadows stretched across the floor like dark fingers reaching toward him. He crawled carefully through debris, moving deeper into the interior, looking for a position where he might delay the enemy for even a few minutes. That was all he needed: minutes. Minutes for the 5 men he had covered to reach the woods. Minutes to keep the Germans from crossing the bridge. Minutes to do his duty. He found a narrow gap in the wall that opened toward the street. Through it he could see them. 4 German soldiers moving in a tight diamond formation, sweeping the rubble with submachine guns raised. Their movements were precise, methodical, the steps of men trained to take down fortified positions. Francis steadied his breath, letting the cold air settle inside his lungs. He braced the rifle against the jagged edge of the wall. He counted their steps. He squeezed the trigger. Crack! The lead soldier jerked backward and collapsed into the snow. The formation erupted in confusion. The remaining 3 spun, firing wildly into the factory ruins. Plaster exploded into dust above Francis' head, showering him with debris. He cycled the rifle swiftly. Crack! The second soldier dropped, screaming and clutching his leg. Francis rolled sideways just as a grenade bounced through the hole where he had been crouched. Boom! The explosion rattled the broken beams. Chunks of concrete tumbled from the ceiling. Smoke filled his lungs, making him cough violently. His ears rang again. He dove down a collapsed staircase into the dark lower floor of the factory. Every limb ached. His vision blurred for moments at a time, but he kept moving. He had no choice. He shifted hiding places, slipping between shadows as the Germans swept room to room, searching for the phantom that refused to die. The building had become his battleground, a maze of echoing steps and falling dust. He knew which floorboards would collapse under weight. He knew where the darkest corners lay. He used every inch of the structure to keep the Germans guessing. He would appear at a cellar window, fire 2 shots, then vanish before they could identify his position. He would drop a piece of wood from a broken roof beam to create a distraction, then circle to the other side and fire again. He was no longer fighting like a soldier, he was fighting like a ghost, yet even ghosts eventually feel the touch of fate. As he moved past a shattered window frame, he stepped on a piece of loose slate. The click echoed through the silent ruins like a scream. A German sniper who had been waiting with unbroken patience across the road reacted instantly. He fired. The shot struck the rim of Francis' helmet with a brutal metallic crack. The impact whipped his head backward so violently that his helmet flew off. Francis felt himself lifted from his feet, slammed against the wall behind him. The rifle slipped from his hands. darkness swallowed him whole. He drifted in silence, unsure if he was alive or dead. Slowly sensation returned in fragments. A deep, pulsing ache filled his skull. His vision swirled into disjointed shapes, shadows, cracking light debris scattered around his body. He tried to move, but his arms refused. His legs felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. He heard voices, German voices. They were inside the building. Ist tot. He is dead. Boots scraped against stone. Equipment rattled. They believed the sniper had finished him. They believed the ghost had been silenced at last. Francis stayed still, letting the illusion hold. He felt dust covering him like a burial cloth. Only the toe of his boot remained visible. The Germans swept the room, stepping around rubble, checking corners, moving deeper into the ruins. The officer barked orders directing them to secure the building and advance toward the bridge. When their footsteps faded, Francis opened his eyes. The world spun, but he forced himself to focus. He forced himself to breathe. He forced his fingers to move an inch at a time. He shifted slowly, dragging himself out from beneath the collapsed drywall. His body trembled. His head felt like it had been split open. He knew he could not fight long. He might not even stand, but he also knew something more important. If he let the Germans reach the bridge, the entire line would collapse. Tanks would cross. Supply depots would fall. Thousands of men might die. He looked around. His rifle lay 3 feet away, but it might as well have been 3 miles. He dug his elbows into the ground, pulling himself inch by inch until his hand touched the cold wood of the stock. He checked the chamber, empty. He reached into his coat. 1 clip, 8 rounds. He crawled toward the back door of the factory, pulling himself through debris. He reached the snow outside, gasping as the cold air shocked his body awake again. He had crossed behind the German line. Ahead of him stood their command vehicle, an armored half-track parked near a hedge. The officer stood in the hatch, scanning the bridge through binoculars, certain that the path ahead was clear. Francis felt the pain in his skull. He felt the tremble in his limbs, but he also felt something stronger. The mission was not over, not until he ended it himself. He lowered his body into a drainage ditch filled with ice water and began to crawl. Inch by inch closer to the enemy, closer to the heart of the fight. Closer to the moment that would decide everything. The drainage ditch was filled with frozen sludge that soaked through Francis' uniform within seconds. The cold stabbed into his chest with a sharpness that felt almost alive. His fingers grew numb around the wooden stock of the M1 rifle as he dragged himself forward inch by inch. Every movement sent a burst of pain through his skull where the sniper round had struck his helmet. His breath came out in broken gasps, forming small clouds that drifted above the ditch before fading into the bitter air. He forced himself to stay low. He forced himself not to groan, even though every bone in his body felt cracked. Ahead of him, the German command half-track stood idle near the hedge. The officer was still in the hatch, scanning the bridge through his binoculars, unaware that the ghost they believed dead was crawling straight toward him. Francis crawled 50 yards through freezing water, then 70. His elbows felt raw. His vision flickered in and out, but his determination held firm. He could not let the Germans secure the bridge. He could not let their armored spearhead break through. Everything he had done from the first bazooka shot to the machine gun stand would mean nothing if he quit now. He reached the edge of the hedgerow. Beyond it lay the road, the half-track, and the tanks preparing to advance. He knew he had only one chance left. His hands shaking, he pushed himself up until he could rest the rifle on a frozen tree root. He steadied his breath. He aimed not at the officer, not at the infantry. He aimed past them, at the fuel drums strapped to the back of the lead tank. He squeezed the trigger. Ping! The rifle fired and the bullet punched a small hole through the metal drum. He fired again, sparks, a third time, a flash erupted. Whoosh! The fuel ignited in a violent blast of orange flames. The fire crawled across the tank hull, sending the crew scrambling out in terror. The burning fuel spilled downward, coating the engine deck. The tank lurched sideways, blocking the narrow road leading to the bridge. The officer whipped around, lowering his binoculars, confusion twisting across his face. Before he could react, Francis fired again. This time at the radio antenna on the command half-track. Crack. The antenna snapped in half, killing their only line of communication. Chaos swallowed the German formation instantly. The officer shouted orders, but no one understood what had happened. A tank was burning. The radio was dead. The sniper had claimed the American was gone, and yet rifle shots were coming from behind their line. Smoke grenades popped as infantry scrambled for cover, believing they were surrounded by a fresh American counterattack. The entire German push began to unravel. The tank crews bailed out. The infantry pulled back. The officer ordered a full retreat from the area. Engines roared as vehicles reversed clumsily down the narrow road. Panic spread through the ranks like wildfire. No one could understand who or what had ambushed them. Francis watched all of it from the ditch, his body trembling with exhaustion. When the last shapes faded into the fog, he fired the rest of his rounds into the smoke to make sure they kept running. Click, click, the rifle fell silent, empty. He let it slip from his grasp and collapse into the mud. His head dropped forward, his pulse slowed. The adrenaline that had fueled him for nearly 6 hours drained away, leaving nothing but cold and fatigue. His body no longer shivered, a bad sign. Hypothermia was creeping in. A dangerous warmth spread through his chest, replacing the cold. His eyelids grew heavy. Snow began to fall again, covering him in a white blanket. He tried to stand, but his legs refused. He tried to crawl, but his arms felt like stone. He rolled onto his back, staring at the darkening sky. The quiet felt peaceful, too peaceful. He thought of the farm where he grew up. He imagined the cows in the pasture, the fence that always needed mending. He wondered faintly if anyone had fixed it. His eyes drifted shut as the night crept over him. The snow continued to fall, gently covering his face. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. He floated in a strange fog between sleep and death, unable to tell which direction he was drifting. Then he heard a sound, crunch, 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 boots in the snow. He did not move. He thought maybe the Germans had returned to finish him. Let them come, he thought. He was too tired to fight anymore. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Over here, a voice shouted. "I found a rifle." Another voice answered, "Check the ditch." He might be in the ditch. Francis tried to speak, but his lips were frozen. He managed only a weak groan. Footsteps hurried toward him. Rough hands grabbed his shoulders, brushing snow away from his face. "Jesus Christ," one man whispered. "It is Curry. Is he dead?" "I do not know." Check his pulse. Warm fingers pressed against his neck. A moment passed, a breath, a heartbeat. He is alive. Get the stretcher. Move. Move, move. It was his squad. The very men he had saved earlier. They had refused to retreat any further. They had chosen to disobey orders so they could search the ruins for the orphan who had stood between them and death. They lifted him gently from the ditch. The pain exploded through his nerves as the blood returned to his limbs, but Francis barely felt it. He felt only the warmth of hands gripping his arms, the sound of his brothers' voices. "We got you, Francis. We got you, buddy. You are going home." His vision blurred. He felt himself lifted onto something flat. A door or a stretcher, he could not tell. He heard more voices, urgent and relieved. He saw faint expressions lit by lantern light. Then everything faded again. The battle was over. He had done what no one thought possible. He had held the bridge alone. He had broken the attack of a German armored spearhead. And now, at last, he let the darkness take him. The cold had almost claimed Francis Curry during those final minutes in the ditch. But the hands of his brothers pulled him back from the edge. They carried him through the snow, their boots slipping on the frozen ground as they moved away from the shattered town of Malmedy. The distant rumble of German engines faded behind them, swallowed by the fog that had once hidden an entire armored division. Francis drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of voices, worried whispers, and hurried commands. Someone wrapped a blanket around him. Someone else shouted for morphine. He felt none of it. He only felt motion and the faint glow of lanterns against the darkness. When Francis next woke, he was no longer on a frozen battlefield. He found himself in a clean white bed, surrounded by the antiseptic scent of a military hospital. The lights were soft, the blankets were warm. For the first time in days, he felt air that did not sting his lungs. A doctor stood by his side, reading from a clipboard, his expression a mixture of disbelief and respect. They told Francis he had frostbite. They told him he had a concussion and shrapnel wounds in both legs. They told him his weight had dropped more than 20 pounds. They told him he was lucky to be alive. Francis did not feel lucky. He stared at the ceiling, quietly absorbing their words, but he still felt the weight of the ditch, the screams, the explosions, the tank shell that had nearly torn him apart. He felt like he had done nothing more than survive long enough to be found. Recovery was slow. He spent months confined to the hospital bed, moving only when nurses insisted, pushing himself through the pain because he refused to let weakness define him. Outside, the war raged on. Then eventually it ended. Germany surrendered. Hitler was gone. The once terrifying King Tigers now sat abandoned, rusting relics of a defeated empire. Francis did not feel triumph. He felt only a strange emptiness. He was a soldier with no battle left to fight. In July 1945, he received unexpected orders instructing him to report to a stadium in Germany for a formal assembly. He assumed it was just another routine, gathering another moment of standing at attention, listening to officers speak. He dressed in a uniform that hung loosely on his thin frame, the fabric barely touching his narrowed shoulders. When he arrived at the stadium, he saw thousands of soldiers already gathered, filling the seats and the field. A military band played in the distance. Flags fluttered in the summer wind. A black car pulled up near the center of the field, drawing every eye. Major General Leland Hobbs stepped out, his presence commanding the entire stadium. He moved down the line of soldiers until he stopped in front of Francis Curry. Francis stiffened instinctively, saluting, though his arm wavered slightly. The general looked at him for a long moment, saying nothing. He studied the boy who had changed the course of a battle without realizing it. Then he opened the citation in his hand, and his voice echoed through the loudspeakers across the entire stadium. Sergeant Francis S. Curry, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The words rolled across the crowd, striking the hearts of every soldier who heard them. The general read the list: the enemy tanks disabled, the half-tracks destroyed, the 5 men rescued from the factory, the 1-man defense of the Malmedy Bridge. Each moment sounded impossible when spoken aloud, as if describing a myth rather than 19-year-old farm boy who had simply refused to die. The crowd fell silent. Thousands of men, many of whom had fought in brutal battles, listened as the deeds of one quiet orphan were spoken into history. The general stepped forward. He placed a blue ribbon around Francis' neck. The Medal of Honor hung from it, the highest military award in the nation. Francis saluted again. His face remained expressionless, but inside he replayed the battle in flashes: the blast of the bazooka, the roar of the .50 caliber, the burning fuel, drums, the cold creeping into his bones. He did not feel like a hero standing there. He felt like a survivor. A photographer captured the moment, snapping a picture that would later be printed across newspapers and tucked into history books. In the photograph, Francis looked confused, almost out of place. He did not resemble the heroic figure described in the citation. He looked like a young man who had wandered onto the wrong stage, yet that photograph became a symbol of American resilience, a symbol of the quiet strength found in ordinary people. When Francis went home, he did not seek fame. He did not go on speaking tours. He did not write a memoir or put on his medal to impress crowds. Instead, he returned to New York and took a job as a counselor for the Veterans Administration. For more than 30 years, he sat in a small office listening to veterans share their nightmares, their struggles, their fears. He helped them find work. He helped them secure medical care. He comforted them in silence, just as he had lived much of his own life. Most of the men he helped never knew who he was. They never knew that the man nodding quietly behind the desk was the same young soldier who stood against an entire German assault. They never knew that the man handing them forms had once destroyed tanks with nothing but grit and instinct. Francis never told them. He never felt the need. His medal did not make him better than anyone else. It simply meant he had lived through something others had not. In his free time he gardened. He repaired fences. He lived the calm, steady life the farm had prepared him for so many years before the war. He died in 2019 at the age of 94, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of the Bulge. When they buried him, they did so with full military honors, but his tombstone did not mention how many enemies he had faced, how many tanks he had stopped, or how many lives he had saved. It listed only his name and his rank, because, in the end, Francis Curry had taught the world something important. Strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is born in hardship, raised in silence, and revealed only when tested by fire. On December 18, 1944, the German army brought a tank to a knife fight. But Francis Curry brought something stronger. He brought the unbreakable resolve of a boy who had survived everything life had thrown at him. And that made him the most dangerous man on that frozen battlefield. Francis Curry did not see himself as a legend after the war ended. He did not walk with the pride of someone who had faced down tanks and infantry alone. He carried himself with the quiet humility of a man who had done what he believed necessary, and then returned to the shadows without expecting praise. When he came home to the United States, he did not speak often about Malmedy. He did not describe how he had stood in freezing snow, how he had sprinted through machine gun fire, how he had fired the bazooka, until there were no rockets left, how he had clung to life as a sniper round nearly killed him. He never bragged about climbing onto a .50 caliber gun while bullets sparked against the armor of the half-track. He never spoke of crawling through an icy ditch to stop a column of tanks with 8 rifle rounds. These moments lived inside him as memories he rarely touched, like tools stored in a dusty shed, never used except when absolutely needed. Instead, Francis quietly rebuilt his life. He settled in New York, where he took a job with the Veterans Administration. The work was not glamorous. It required patience, compassion, and a strong stomach for the emotional weight carried by the men who walked through his office doors. Many of them were broken in ways the world could not see. They carried invisible wounds from beaches, jungles, mountains, and towns whose names most people had already forgotten. Francis listened. He listened to confessions whispered through tears. He listened to stories told in trembling voices about battles lost and friends buried. He listened without judgment, without interruption, without ever mentioning his own past. He helped those veterans in any way he could, guiding them toward health care benefits and counseling and steady jobs. He was their advocate, their support, their silent anchor. Most of them never knew who he really was. To them, he was a soft-spoken counselor with tired eyes and the patience of a saint. They never guessed that this man had once stood against an entire German armored spearhead. They never guessed that this man had once been recommended for the highest military honor in the country. Francis preferred it that way. Fame held no value for him. Recognition felt unnecessary. He wanted a life free from the noise of medals and ceremonies. He had fought because he needed to protect the men beside him, not because he wanted to be remembered as a hero. In his spare time, Francis lived as simply as he had on the Indiana farm where he grew up. He gardened, growing tomatoes in straight, neat rows. He built shelves. He fixed things around the house. He found peace in the quiet tasks of everyday life, the same way he once found focus in the chaos of battle. His childhood had taught him that satisfaction came from doing the work, not from being seen doing it. As the decades passed, people slowly forgot the details of the Battle of the Bulge. The tanks were scrapped. The trenches vanished beneath wild grass. The cold fields of Belgium warmed with new seasons. Yet the story of one orphan farm boy lived on in military records and whispered recollections among aging soldiers who had witnessed the impossible. They remembered the young man who seemed to appear everywhere at once, firing rockets at tanks and machine guns at infantry. They remembered the sight of a boy silhouetted on top of a half-track, firing a .50 caliber weapon with relentless determination. They remembered how he had bought them time to escape, time to live. When Francis reached his later years, he did not appear at many commemorative events. He did not attend ceremonies honoring the Battle of the Bulge unless he absolutely had to. Crowds made him uneasy. Cameras made him uncomfortable. Even when asked about the medal, he rarely answered with more than a shrug. It was just something that happened, he would say. Nothing more. On quiet nights, he sat alone, sometimes in his yard, sometimes near a window, and thought about the men who never came home. Those thoughts weighed on him more heavily than any medal ever could. Then in 2019, at the age of 94, Francis Curry passed away. News of his death spread slowly, then rapidly reaching veterans groups, military historians, and families across the country. The last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of the Bulge was gone. Soldiers young and old learned the story of the farm boy who had single-handedly stopped tanks. The story of a man who had done the unthinkable not for glory, but out of duty and instinct. They buried him with full military honors. The flag folded over his coffin carried the solemn weight of a grateful nation. A rifle salute cracked through the air before the final notes of taps drifted into the wind. The tombstone placed above his grave was simple. It listed only his name and his rank. No mention of the tanks he destroyed. No mention of the men he saved. No mention of the medal that had changed his life. And that simplicity felt right because Francis had always believed that real heroism did not require recognition. It required resolve. It required grit. It required stepping forward when everyone else stepped back. The farm boy from Indiana had shown the world that ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary moments. Strength was not measured by size or muscle. It was measured by heart, by the refusal to surrender no matter how impossible the odds. On December 18, 1944, the German army brought overwhelming force into a quiet Belgian town. They brought tanks heavier than House's infantry, trained to destroy fortified positions and weapons capable of leveling entire buildings. But Francis Curry brought determination sharpened by hardship. He brought the steady mind of a man who had survived abandonment, hunger, and loneliness long before he ever faced a battlefield. He brought the instincts of someone who had always fixed things that were broken and protected the few things he had in life. History remembers many battles, many leaders, many machines of war. But stories like Francis remind us that sometimes the smallest figure on the field can change everything. He showed that courage does not roar like a tank engine. Sometimes it whispers quietly inside a thin young man who refuses to let fear decide his fate. And in those 10 unbelievable minutes in the snow, the orphan farm boy who was told he was too small to fight became the strongest man on earth. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.